Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming today. So we're going to have an excellent panel of researchers spanning the topics related to food systems and climate change from a research perspective. So you might have heard this if you are involved in the sustainability movement at all, but food is inextricably linked to climate change, both from contributions to climate change. Our food system as a whole contributes about 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's across the whole supply chain, so including the portion of transportation-related emissions that are for moving our food supply, to producing food in agricultural production, all the way to how we consume, waste, dispose of our food. Brent is going to talk today about the need to mitigate those emissions in order to meet our climate goals. And at the same time, our food system is going to be affected by climate change. The amount of food that's produced and our food security from a production perspective, the stability of our supply chains, and how different changes, as we've seen in COVID, for instance, where there are gaps or shortages can have knock-on and side effects across the whole supply chain. And so there are a lot of ways that the food system is going to be impacted by climate change. And as a result, there is a lot of work going on to figure out how we can better adapt and be more resilient to the effects of climate change. And Elsie is going to present some research around the food system resilience side. And all of these assumptions are based on trying to make predictions about the future and trying to understand what current trajectories we're on and where and how, if we make changes, we can better improve and change those scenarios. And so Professor Stan Becker is going to provide an overview of some of the underlying assumptions that go into some of these scenarios, particularly around population growth. And so before we begin, I want to introduce our speakers, and then we'll get started. We want to leave time for questions at the end, so I don't want to speak too long. And I will say I'm also, my name is Rachel, and I'm a program officer at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, where I work closely with Brent and Elsie on a day-to-day basis. So Professor Stan Becker is an emeritus professor with the Department of Population, Family, and Reproductive Health. His research spans a variety of topics, including reproductive health interventions that involve couples, the estimation of fertility and mortality in developing countries, and informal demography. He also gives lectures on population growth with a historical and ecological perspective, as we will be discussing today. He earned his PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 1978. Brent Kim is a research program manager at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. His research spans issues from farm to fork, with published works on sustainable diets, climate change, industrial food animal production, food and agricultural policy, soil safety, and urban food systems. Brent is also a frequent speaker, educator, and writer on these topics, translating science for policymakers, journalists, and other key audiences. His work has been featured in Popular Science, The Guardian, The Huffington Post, NPR, Newsweek, and Civil Leads. Prior to joining the center in 2008, Brent earned his master's in global disease epidemiology and control from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And Elsie Moore is a PhD candidate in the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and a research assistant at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. Her research focuses on understanding equitable strategies that advance sustainable and resilient food systems. Before her PhD, Elsie worked on a multi-country collaboration on the role of academic institutions in advancing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Elsie earned her MPH from the Yale School of Public Health, where her research and practice concentrated on the health impacts of climate change. And now I will pass it off to Professor Becker.
Can you show me the pointer? The pointer works.
Maybe this.
So this advances slides. No. How do I advance?
All right, then I would press this button.
Okay.
That arrow.
Okay. Thank you. So here's a brief outline, except I can't see it. I see it here, right? Anyway, we're going to look at population projections. The United Nations does them, and we have a European group that's done them in recent history. And a little bit about problems with food, though the other speakers will cover those more, so I may go fast through that. The limits to arable land, limits to increases in yields, greenhouse gas emissions from food production, animal husbandry under that, and other non-trivial problems. So basics of population. When I was born, 1950, I'm an old man, right? 2.5 billion on the planet. Now there are 8 billion. In my mother's lifetime, she was born 1927, still alive. The population is virtually quadrupled. So we have very, very rapid growth of our own species on the planet, pushing other species out. About 70 million people are added each year. Be careful when you read news reports about declining this and that. The world is still increasing rapidly, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. There is actually a decline in some countries. Japan and Italy are in that category, but not very many. We live in a demographically divided world. We have something called the total fertility rate. I should be pointing, I guess, right? Which is the pointer? Anybody see anything? The red thing? Doesn't work, huh? Okay. Anyway, you can read and follow. I'm going top to bottom, basically. The total fertility rate is the number of children, number of births a woman would have if she had births according to the rate of this year. We don't know, we have to project, we don't know if she's 25, how many births she's going to have, do we? We can ask her, but it turns out if you ask people, it's not a very good predictor because economic situation changes, marital status changes, and that sort of thing. Anyway, the replacement is 2.1 because some births don't survive to reproduction. Otherwise, it would be 2. In the world, the total fertility rate now is 2.3. In the US, it's 1.6, and China is 1.3. Nevertheless, the US population is increasing. Chinese population, you heard the media starting to decline, but that's momentum kept China's population growing until this year, though its fertility rate was below replacement, less than 2, since 1991. Population momentum is a huge factor, and I think I got a picture on that a little later. This shows projections to 2075. Asia, you see with a slight decline there. Japan, China declined by then. Africa, huge increase, and the others pretty well constant. So greenhouse gas emissions and needed food production. First of all, I don't go to 2100. If you read something that does projections to 2100, you can discount it. Why? Because what I say there, very few people alive today will be alive in 2100. Some of the younger ones here are an exception. Very few people in 2100 are alive today. So projections to 2100 rely virtually totally on our projections of fertility. And those are notoriously poor. Before in the 1920s, they projected the United States would have 160 million by 2000. We were close to 280 million, I think, in 2000. So because fertility was very low at that point, they didn't foresee the baby boom in World War II and that sort of thing. Anyway, so they're done by the United Nations every 2 years. And since the 60s, and they use Bayesian methods, very fancy. So you borrow data from other countries if you don't have good data for yours. And they have to incorporate more, obviously, fertility and mortality, and then net migration. The Europeans, a group from 3 different institutions, got together and they did their own projections, which IPCC is actually using now rather than the UN ones. And I'm going to look at the UN median projection and fertility half a birth higher and half a birth lower than total fertility than what the UN median one is. And then I'll also look what SSP, shared socioeconomic pathway, that the Europeans have done, which they've done their own slightly different way. Here's a little bit about those. They have what's these SSP, shared economic pathway. We looked at SSP1 and SSP3. 1 is the good news sort of thing. Low fertility goes down to about 1.6 by 2075. That is low fertility, and SSP3 is relatively higher fertility. It still goes down about to replacement by 2075, if I remember right. But you have regional rivalry, and these are stories that go with them. I don't think demographically you don't actually put in the stories, but they link those with RCPs from the IPCC of 2.6 for SSP1 and 8.5 or 6 for SSP3. And the recent one is 8.5, and that has to do with radiative forcing, how much sunlight hits the Earth per square meter sort of thing. It's not sunlight per se, but you can look it up if you want more detail. Here I show you the SSP 3. Point with my finger. No, anyway, at the top, SSP3 and the UN high, that's a half a birth higher. Notice they've taken it higher. I put an X where the actual value is. They did these about 2 years ago, and sure enough, they were pretty good on the median, and the higher had fertility going higher than it is now, and the lower has it lower than it is now. So the UN's does pretty well with its projections at the median. Anyway, we can go from where that X is down to the low or up to the high in the next few years, depending on what happens in Africa in particular. But that shows the models that I used or just reviewed. There's the UN, these are the projections. The median, they have about 10 billion by 2075, and the low goes back to 8 billion. Same with SSP1, whereas the high, SSP3 and the UN half a birth higher, go up to about 12 or so billion. So it makes a lot of difference, half a birth. Okay, over to agriculture. So we have, this is from my co-author, Jessica Fanzo, who's a Bloomberg scholar at SAIS. The habitable land there, 50% for agriculture. Of that, 77% is used for livestock, 23%. Brent may give you slightly different numbers, but he's seen these, and depending on how you estimate things, you get slightly different numbers. And then the problem is, of course, the livestock, that they only give 18% of global calories and take 77% of the land, whereas the other crops, a lot of the other crops, as you'll hear from them, are grown to feed the livestock. So, first of all, there's major problems. Food production would have to increase by 35 to 56% by 2050. That's with the median projection. So the problem is almost all the good arable land is already under cultivation. Most of the unconverted land suitable for crops is in forested areas, i.e. the Amazon, or in Congo, or in Indonesia. Forests are being destroyed to provide more land for cultivation. Growing palm oil, if you look at almost any processed food you buy, it seems, in the supermarket, if you look at the label, it has palm oil. Because it's cheap, it comes at the cost of the forest in Indonesia in particular. And the soy and cattle from the Amazon, they grow the soy to feed the cattle, whether it's here or in Europe. So the destruction of the Amazon related to that. And the other problem, yields per hectare only increasing slowly, and made agriculture a major contributor. You'll hear more about that. Seafood, 35% of the wild fish species are already fished at or beyond sustainable levels. So if you eat, I don't know, I don't eat fish, but whatever, chances are, if it's, which ones are 50% now are aquaculture, not wild. Some of them here in you get in Baltimore. Anyway, so another problem is if people get richer, which we'd like, they tend to eat more meat. And meat is a major problem, which you'll hear from the others. The major cause of GHG emissions, in particular methane, and I give some sources on that one. This one, I just did a plot with the data, that's actually Wikipedia. You see the Amazon forest, how much is remaining, and I just did a linear plot, but there's papers that talk about, it's not gonna be linear, it's gonna be worse than linear. It's gonna go down faster because of, I'm not sure what they call it, the resiliency. We'll hear from our other speakers about that you get a piece of forest and it can't survive by itself sort of thing. And that's what's happening in the Amazon, they're carving it up. Other non-trivial problems, many countries have higher priority on economic development than in preserving biodiversity. We have a debate in my class on this each year. Should countries give higher priority to economic development? Well, if you go to the country, of course, we want our people to be richer. So who cares about the forest in the Congo? Well, these nice green folks from the West come over and tell us we ought to preserve our forest, but they're not giving us food on the table. So we'll continue mining, et cetera, et cetera. Poor progress in GHG, decreasing GHG emissions, high desired family size. A paper showed in sub-Saharan Africa, the average was people, if you ask women how many children they want, they say the average was 4.4. Not close to 2. What do? Well, educate girls is one of the best things, and yet it's not in the short term because if they're 6 years old, they're not going to be reproducing for another 10 or so years anyway. So in the short term, the thing to do is get governments to make contraceptive available and at low cost or free. Then we also have positive feedbacks in the climate system. I mentioned two there, the melting Arctic ice. What's the problem there? Well, it melts and then you have the water, and water doesn't reflect as much sunlight as ice does. And the permafrost melt. What happens when the permafrost melts? You get the CO2 and the methane go into the air that would have been sequestered before. You have tipping points. There was a paper on this that we're very close to tipping points, and once we pass those, we can't go back. And sustainable population, I don't know if you can read this. Yeah, you can read it. These are 5 peer-reviewed articles that estimated what is a sustainable population for the Earth. Notice the estimates here. Are any of them close to 8? No. What's happening? What's happening is we're living on the principle of the planet. Fossil fuels take millions of years to produce, right? We're using up fossil fuels to fuel our lifestyles. Same with rare elements, the lithium in these nice batteries we're getting. Once it's gone, right? So we have to get into recycling. And it tells the assumptions over there. You could call this Malthusian because we're going to have a collapse if these things are true sometime in the future. Some people are predicting it in the literature now, but those are ways we could get out of it. The Malthusian has been proved wrong several times. The Green Revolution is one recent example, recent history, where we thought we couldn't feed 8 billion people, but now we can because we have fertilizers. Where do fertilizers come from? Fossil fuels, yeah. And irrigation. Irrigation, we know anybody from the Midwest that uses the Ogallala Aquifer, Kansas, what are the other states? Colorado, New Mexico. Anyway, the aquifer is going down every year because even parts of California, I think, they're pulling up water to irrigate crops. And once it's gone, it takes years and years to replenish. So we're living on the principle of the planet is what is the moral of this story. How am I doing on time? 3 minutes more? 1 minute?
We should try to wrap up.
Wrap up. Okay, I think there's only 2 more slides. So, okay, this from my colleague talks about definitions of hunger under the SSP1 and SSP3. Just look at the total there, 282 million by 2050, whereas SSP3 with that half birth higher has about 916 million people suffering from hunger. Okay, conclusion, wrapping up. On the population side, I mentioned we have to encourage a small family norm. We talk about reproductive coercion. That's where the man throws the pills in the toilet or something, but we have reproductive coercion on the other end. We have pressure on women to bear children. Less in this country than in some other countries, but it's definitely there. So we have to take that off is one thing. Give women a chance to have their own lives and decide if they want to have children or not. And in addition, we need the one-child family to get down the fertility to below 2. Some people have to have none or one child. And the younger generations thinking about this to save the planet, maybe that's one of the things we can do. Contraceptive services, I mentioned, we have to worry about aging. You'll see this in the papers all the time. The Japanese, how are they going to take care of all these old people? Well, one of the things they've done is robots. Robots can even turn you over in bed and that sort of thing. And people like them, they talk to you and all, etc. On the food side, maybe I should skip these. Okay, because you're going to get these from the other folks, but there's lots of possibilities, and that's what in that table I showed you also. Those are things, if we can get into fusion energy or something that may up the numbers that are on that slide. That's the hope, but given the current reality, we're in bad shape on certainly on climate. One thing I want to say to the whole audience, don't say climate change. It's not climate change. You change clothes, you change job. Change is neutral. It's climate crisis. We have a crisis on our hands, and you need to correct people who say climate change. I'm sorry that's all in the media, but that's one reason perhaps that we're not doing much about it. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Professor Becker. Oh, there's no battery. Okay, yes. Professor Becker wisely compelled me a while back to stop saying climate change. So got it right this time. We got climate crisis. And all of you wouldn't be here probably if you didn't agree that the climate crisis is change is kind of stuck in my brain. It's almost hard not to say change. The crisis is easily one of the greatest public health, ecological, and economic crises, not only of our time, but for generations to come. So global scientists and leaders have agreed, per the 2015 Paris Agreement, that we need to cap global average temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius relative to the pre-industrial era. And ideally, we would be limiting that temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So how are we doing? Not great. So on this graph, you can see that on the x-axis, you have the past 40 decades or so. And on the y-axis, you have the change in temperatures in degrees Celsius relative to the pre-industrial era. And you can see it tracking up and up and up and up. And it's approaching 1 degree. And this publication was from 2020. As of 2021, we've surpassed 1 degree Celsius of warming, and we are now at 1.1 degree. So we're not doing well in that regard. And in fact, a recent UN report from 2022 analyzed all of the country commitments that they agreed upon in the Paris Agreement. And based on those commitments, we are potentially in a worst case scenario headed toward almost 3 degrees of warming. So we are, rapidly on track to exceed those climate mitigation targets. So what is the role of food and agriculture in either meeting those targets or exceeding them? So here on the x-axis, you have decades from now until the end of the century. And I'm going to do exactly what Professor Becker said that we should not do, which is rely on population projections to the end of the century. So apologies. So with that in mind, then maybe acknowledge that these are a little iffy. But the general point remains that on the y-axis, you have the degrees of warming. Now, this warming that we're seeing in these projections are strictly the warming that are attributable to global demand for food. So this is only the food sector. And from the food sector alone, we have a couple of different projections based on the SSPs that Professor Becker talked about. And from the food sector alone, ignoring energy, industry, transportation, or anything else, in the worst case scenario, we're potentially looking at almost 1 degree of warming purely from food alone. Remember that we're already at 1.1 degree of warming. The absolute limit that we should be aiming for is 2 degrees of warming. 1 plus 1 point math, 1.1 plus that 0.9 already puts us at 2. We're not even thinking about any of the other sectors. Here's another way to think about that same problem. This is from a report that Rachel and I put out in 2015, right before one of the climate change mitigation meetings in Paris. So here we can see the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture in 2010. And then stacked on top of that, we have emissions from all the other sectors, industry, energy, transport, and so forth. The y-axis is gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year to measure greenhouse gas emissions. So that's 2010. We can project that out into the future. So here's the year 2050, under a business as usual scenario in which global meat and dairy intake continues to rise as projected by the FAO. So we see a substantial increase. This red dashed line is the target for all sectors combined that we have to stay below to have at least a 2/3 probability of keeping warming below that 2 degrees Celsius target. So something's wrong with this picture, right? Right? Yes, Mark knows, right? So all sectors combined have to stay below that target. Yes, we absolutely have to cut back on international flights. We urgently need to shift to renewable energy. We need to curb population growth. All of those things, yes, to shrink this. But there's no way we're going to shrink all of this to be small enough to stack it on top of that and still be below that target. So agriculture may not be the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, but if we ignore it, we will be deep in the category, deep in the territory of the most catastrophic climate change, climate crisis scenarios. So that's pretty grim. There are some things we can do about it, though. 3 interventions. First, and again, don't get too hung up on the specific numbers, but in this specific analysis, they looked at a 75% global reduction in meat and dairy intake, which would shave off about 7.5 gigatons. And if you combine that with a halving of global food waste, And then also some changes in the way we produce food, including methods that would increase agricultural yields. Taken together, we can knock off 15 or so gigatons, which would at least give us some shot at staying below that target. So there is some hope there. And since Rachel and I published that report in 2015, this message has been echoed again and again and again and again in the scientific literature. And the message is the same. There are 3 interventions that we need: shifting toward plant-forward diets, reducing food waste, and changing the way we grow food. Any one of those interventions alone will likely not get us where we need to go. We'll need a combination of all 3 of those working in conjunction. So you might be wondering, why is there so much of a focus on food and agriculture and shifting toward plant-forward diets in particular? The reason is that livestock is estimated to be responsible for an estimated 15% of the global human-caused greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change, and that's larger than the global transportation sector. If we zoom in on that 15%, we can see that the largest share of those emissions are attributable to enteric fermentation. So that is a digestive process unique to ruminant animals, or animals with multiple stomachs like cows and goats. As a byproduct of that digestive process, they release methane, and it comes out the front as eructation or burps. It doesn't come out the backside so much as farts, even though people talk a lot about cattle farts. It's really more the burps. Another major source of both methane and nitrous oxide, 2 very potent greenhouse gases, are the anaerobic decomposition of manure, such as you would see at this manure lagoon, as it's called. It's a euphemism for a storage pit outside of the swine operation in North Carolina. So thousands of animals are housed in those operations, and then the waste is pumped out into a liquid storage pit, such as this one. And as the manure decomposes, in addition to releasing very potent odors, it also contributes to climate change. We also have greenhouse gas emissions from growing feed crops for the animals. And as Professor Becker mentioned, we of course also have deforestation of the Amazon shown in this aerial photo. Soy gets a pretty bad rap, but really the dominant reason for deforestation in the Amazon, at least currently, is actually grazing lands for cattle, more so than growing feed for the cattle, although that's also a contributor. So with all of that in mind, let's take another look at this before, if you remember. Hopefully it was only like 2 minutes ago, so you probably remember. Going back to this, remember we talked about how in this scenario, in the worst case scenario, we were looking at 0.9 degrees of warming. So this is actually a severe underestimate. The reason for that is that in these scenarios, they are holding dietary patterns constant. The reason for the increase over time are twofold. 1, population is growing, and 2 is that there's an accumulation of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So with carbon in particular, once carbon dioxide is released in the atmosphere, it effectively stays there for forever. Methane eventually breaks down, but it still accumulates over time. So, you know, this is a result of accumulating emissions and population growth, but diet is not changing. This is an underestimate because globally, based on projections, animal product demand is projected to rise by 70%. Ruminant meat, specifically the most greenhouse gas intensive of those, is projected to rise by 90%. So potentially the scenario could be much, much worse in terms of greenhouse gas emissions from food and agriculture. And in fact, this same study did identify the top 4 contributors to the warming that we saw in that previous slide. They are, from highest to lowest, ruminant meat being number 1, rice number 2, then dairy, then all other forms of meat. All the other foods are pretty small contributors to that. Now, you might see this and think, oh gosh, rice is actually almost as bad as beef. So should I maybe not eat rice along with reducing my red meat intake? Well, so in defense of rice, these are global totals. So it's taking into account the mass of food that is consumed by people. And we have to keep in mind that rice is a staple crop for billions and billions of people. So that has to be factored in when you consider, like, this is the net total across the entire world of all these foods. So when we actually look at rice on like a per serving or a per calorie or per gram of protein basis, and we compare it to beef that way, we get a very different story. So here on the y-axis, we have kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents, greenhouse gases. We're not looking at global totals anymore. Now we're looking at per 100 grams of protein. And on the x-axis, we have different foods. So plant foods in green on the left, animal foods in orange on the right. You can see there's a pretty wide range for some of these foods because of different estimates in the literature, but the patterns are clear. Oh, blue bars are medians. The patterns are pretty clear in that per gram of protein, animal foods are an order of magnitude more greenhouse gas intensive to produce than plant foods. So this is my defense of rice. My father is Korean, so I think he'd be rolling in his grave. Heard me demonizing rice for climate change research. So I'm fully being transparent about that bias that I do have. But in all fairness, I think, and this pattern holds whether we're looking at per calorie, per serving, no matter how you slice it. So it doesn't mean that all of us need to go 100% vegan. And in fact, there are some countries with high rates of malnutrition where the intervention is going to be very different than what we might have in a high meat consuming country like the US. But that's a topic for another day. Let me summarize. So food demand, not the largest, but a major contributor to the climate crisis. And if we don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, we will likely fail to meet those targets. And there are three critical interventions, not one by themselves. It has to be three working in conjunction, shifting toward plant-forward diets. Again, there's not a one-size-fits-all strategy for all countries and all people. We have to make sure this is a nuanced approach that accounts for nutritional viability, differences in culture, and so forth. Reducing food waste and changing how we produce food. And this is a whole big topic that we can unpack for another day. But that's the big picture of it. So thank you. I will stop there and pass on to my colleague, Elsie Moore. Thank you.
Great. Well, it's exciting to get to follow both of these presentations, and it's a real pleasure to be here this morning and speaking at this symposium. The other two presentations and the one that just went was really focused on how we mitigate global climate change. But we also know that we're seeing a lot of the impacts of climate change and disasters happening right now and in the near future. And while we absolutely need to work on mitigation, there's also a role for adaptation and building resiliency within the food system to some of these disruptions. So I'm going to be talking about today building resilient and equitable food systems. Before I jump into the topic, I want to really just briefly acknowledge the many people who have been involved in this project as well as the funding source. We have people from the Center for a Livable Future, we have people from the Bloomberg Center for Government Excellence, as well as we've partnered with 5 cities in the United States on our resiliency work: Austin, Texas, Baltimore, Maryland, Denver, Colorado, and Moorhead, Minnesota, as well as Orlando, Florida. And this has been funded by the National Science Foundation, as well as the Bloomberg American Health Initiative. So the goals of my very short talk today are 3 things. What is food system resilience? Why is food system resilience an important research and practice topic? And then how you can get started with food system resiliency work or advanced resiliency work that might already be happening. So let's jump right into that first question. What is food system resilience? Well, food system resilience in many ways is a relatively nascent term. Resiliency has been around for a long time, thinking about individual resiliency as well as ecological resiliency. But the application of it to the food system is still pretty new. But in our work, we use this definition, which I'm showing here on the slide, that food system resiliency is the capacity over time of a food system in all of its units at multiple levels to provide sufficient, appropriate, and accessible food for all in the face of various unforeseen disturbances. And I've highlighted a couple pieces of that definition that we're going to unpack in the next couple of slides, but really, in short, what it's saying is how can we build food systems that are equitable and provide food security before, during, and after disruptive events? So if we take that first part of the definition, which was highlighted, which is the capacity over time of the food system, and this is a graphic by Jess Fonzo and colleagues who was spoken about earlier, and it really shows kind of the complexities of the food system. And I'm not going to go over the definition here with this group because we've been talking about food and food system, but I like this graphic because it shows the multiple parts of it, but it also shows some of the external drivers and outcomes of those processes and the relationships and the feedback loops between them. And when you're working on food system resiliency, it's really helpful to think about what is the geographic and temporal scope of the food system that you're talking about. Global food system, regional food system, city food system, the food system of Johns Hopkins University. So when you're conceptualizing it, what is the unit of the food system that you're interested in, and how do all of these other levels interplay with it? Looking at another part of the definition, which was highlighted, which is in the face of various and even unforeseen disasters. And really, disasters can be natural or they can be human-made. Many of them are related to climate change in some way. And they can also be in the form of a shock, which is more of a sudden disturbance, or a stressor, a gradual eroding of the food system. And we know that climate change is already causing more severe weather events, long-term droughts, and these implications are harming food production, distribution, as well as people's ability to access foods. We've also seen economic crises of food inflation and cuts to supplemental nutrition assistance programs, which are impacting the ways that people are able to afford food. So part of food system resiliency is also thinking about what are the hazards that are going to impact this food system that you scoped, and which ones are of interest today and also in the future. And then the last part of the definition I highlighted is to provide sufficient, appropriate, and accessible food for all. And I think this graph is helpful in thinking about this, to look at how well a food system is functioning to begin with here on this axis, on the y-axis. That could be measured by food insecurity rates within a jurisdiction or a community. And it's going along and it's functioning, and then some sort of disturbance happens, a shock or a stressor, seen by the red dot dropping down in this graph. There's then a period of emergency response and recovery where a food system rises back up to that prior state. And resilience is really both about how much a system is impacted by a disruption, but then also how quickly it can recover. But it's important to think about that many food systems aren't equitable, they aren't just, they aren't functioning initially at the level that we hope they would be. So part of food system resiliency is about bouncing back better. How do you create more equitable and just food systems in that recovery period, or even before, to have them function at a higher level? So now moving on to why food system resiliency. There are many reasons you might want to work on this topic, and we're going to explore just a couple of them now because we only have a brief amount of time. And so I'm providing 3 key rationales for this work and how it can be helpful. 1, food system resiliency work can help to prepare for disruptive events by improving one's knowledge and understanding of potential threats. Is it pandemics? Is it civil unrest? Is it climate change impacts, and how they can actually disrupt a food system? 2, it can also help in responding to food system disruptions more efficiently and effectively when you have a plan in place and existing relationships with key actors to support in these response efforts. And 3, it can also create more equitable and just food systems and uproot the systems and the structures that are creating inequities in our food systems. And I want to really briefly just spend a little bit more time on that equity piece of it, because it's really critical to food system resiliency work. And that in ours, we frame it around the 4 pillars of equity work, that food system resiliency really needs to target procedural equity, distributional equity, structural equity, as well as intergenerational equity. And lastly, I want to talk about a few things that we've been working on and some resources that we've developed that might be of interest to people in the audience. So in April 2020, we formed a food system resilience community of practice. And this community of practice was comprised of the 5 cities, or representatives from the 5 cities that I showed in the acknowledgement, which aimed to create and foster a collaborative learning environment and network of cities working on food system resiliency. Another goal of it was to develop and test tools that could help these cities plan for food system resiliency work, and then also to monitor, does a community of practice help to build the resiliency of those that are participating as a part of it? This also all happened during COVID-19, and so it created a space for real-time learning around emergency response efforts around food system resiliency. And this work built on previous work at the Center for Livable Future with Baltimore City on food system resiliency. So who is involved in this? Again, showing the 5 cities, which I mentioned previously, but the goal in recruiting them was to create a diversity of cities, get cities of different geographic threats, different climate change threats, different levels of food system resiliency planning, different regional interactions. And so just taking one example, Moorhead, Minnesota, it's on the border of Fargo, North Dakota. And so they have to think a lot about the interplay between those 2 cities working together and how that impacts their food system resiliency work. We used a mixed method embedded design to kind of facilitate and evaluate this community of practice. So we had, before the intervention, participants completed a baseline survey to their knowledge and understanding of food system resiliency, as well as what was happening in their jurisdiction. We then had 6 months of facilitated monthly sessions where we worked together to develop food system resiliency resources that could be used in other locations and by other stakeholders. And then at the end, we did kind of an exit survey and interviews. And all this information we brought together into a planning guide, which I'll talk about next. So this planning guide, which we released in December of 22, is really a suite of resources to help stakeholders go through the process of food system resiliency. So it has 6 modules to get started with this work, to implement an equity and justice centered framework in it, to define and scope the food system that's of interest, to assess the hazards that may impact a food system, to develop strategies, and then to implement and measure them. And this was all co-developed by the researchers at Johns Hopkins and the cities themselves. And so the goal was to make it really actionable and to be tool focused. And so we have these 12 tools to help people actually work through these steps, which we've built into a separate workbook that people can use and share with colleagues and put into different platforms to make it very collaborative. And then we've also been working on some research manuscripts as well from this. So to give just one example of a tool, there's many of them in the planning guide, but this is a part of the jurisdictional inventory, which is in one of the early modules, the Get Started modules, which helps the user go through and think about their current level of food system resiliency, the current hazards that may impact the food system, and then who they might want to bring together to work to advance it. So this, again, is just one piece to look at it, but there's many more. And then the planning guide also provided a lot of different case studies and examples and the words of people that were working on this in the city. So I wanted to leave you with this one thought from a community of practice member who shared when talking about how COVID-19 had shifted their understanding of food system resiliency work. And they said, the biggest lesson is food is never considered a top priority for those who are not food insecure. And now it's blatantly obvious that it's a big issue. And I think the presentations on this panel have really highlighted the urgency of this work and how we can think about strategies to mitigate and build resiliency. So if you want to learn more, the QR code or the Center for a Livable Future website, you can access the planning guide. All the resources are free, as well as more information on it. We just put out a podcast where we talk about kind of the planning guide and the work, which you can access on the GovX Data Points podcast, or you're welcome to contact the PI of the project, Ronnie Neff, or me, if you want to learn more. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elsie, Brent, and Professor Becker. I will open it up to the floor now. We don't have a ton of time for questions, but want to see what you all have to say. And I also will mention this is the first of 2 food systems panels today. The second one will focus on how we're implementing this research into practice at the university.
I really appreciated your focus on equity, and I was wondering, I know the other 2 panels didn't have as much time to discuss this, but it would be really great to talk a little bit about the differences in consumption. So, you know, the graphs that you showed and you know, the trends over time, and also, you know, about population, we treat those units as sort of the same, but we know that there's huge differences in consumption across settings. And so I just wanted to I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that, I'm an anthropologist, public health person, but the equity piece, I think I would love for you to comment on that a little bit, just maybe go through your first and second panels, because there, the enormity of consumption in high income countries is completely different from, and it's obviously written about this in low middle income settings. And I think when we set them up as sort of equal on graphs, it makes it look like the main concern is, consumption practices of people who might have higher fertility rates. But, if you compare it, right, the per unit consumption in wealthy, predominantly white settings is quite different. So there's like I think a major like colonial racial justice piece here that I'd love to maybe talk a little bit about.
Yes, of course, I teach the IPAC formula. So every country and the ecological footprint analyses. And the ecological footprint shows why you're right. And yes, we consume so much more in the West, in the North. But the IPAC shows that the impact on the environment is a function of population and affluence and the technology it takes to do that affluence. So he talked about ruminants, for example, and if you eat more meat, you have more impact. We eat more meat in this country, for example, and worse in Australia, I think, anyway. So if I had time, I'd go into those formulas, but population is always one of them. And people have to eat, so what they eat, yes, varies widely around the world. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I'm really glad you brought that up. Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a limitation of some of these global overviews. You get a big picture of the problem, but when you actually break it down country by country, there's a nuanced story there that I think is really important. So actually, Rachel and I worked on a paper in 2019 where we looked at country-specific dietary shifts because, like I said, there's no one size fits all. The United States is among Australia, I think, is higher than us, I think, and regardless, both countries are in the top 10 per capita meat consuming countries in the entire world. So the intervention for a country like us, well, even within the US, there's still disparities in terms of access, right? So when we think of sustainability, there's always a danger, right, of just putting on climate change blinders and purely thinking of, well, this is what we need to do for climate change. But at the center, we are systems thinkers, and so we have to acknowledge, right? So the definition of a sustainable diet is that, at least as I like to define it, yes, it has to be ecologically sound, but that's only number one. Number two, it has to be economically viable. It must be culturally appropriate. It must be nutritionally viable, which is critical, and people must have physical and economic access to those foods. So you could have a dietary pattern that's like the best thing in the world for climate change, but if it doesn't check all those other boxes, it's not truly sustainable if you're in a lower middle income countries where there are high rates of stunting and malnutrition. And those are populations for whom their animal product intake is already next to none. So to talk about reducing animal product intake and plant forward diets in those contexts is absurdly out of place. And in fact, for those populations, just a modest increase in animal product intake could do wonders in preventing stunting, malnutrition, and a lot of these lifelong health burdens. And in fact, our research found that if those countries were to increase their animal product intake to meet minimal nutritional targets, that would actually increase greenhouse gas emissions for those countries slightly. And climate change can't be the only priorities for those countries because those people have to be eating and curbing stunting. So what that means is for countries like the United States, the pressure is even greater upon us because we have to reduce a little more to offset what we will expect to be an increase in those other countries. I mean, maybe it's just, we're not talking that those countries adopt the Western US diet, but a small increase in animal product intake could make a world of difference for malnutrition. So thank you. Yeah.
Can you all speak on the role of like food producers and like the USDA or like the FDA and like creating the food that's available especially in our country? Like, I think there's a lot of pressure on the consumer to consume less red meat, which is, there is an individual responsibility, but there's only so many options. Can you all just like speak about that?
I have thoughts, but I'm going to jump into the conversation.
Go ahead and start if you want to.
Okay, I'll just say, one of my peers is Mary Nessel. She's a fantastic Dr. Mary Nessel. She's an amazing researcher. And she always says, vote with your fork, which is what we put a lot of emphasis on, change your diet for climate change, but also vote with your vote, right? So And we can't put all the pressure on consumers, right? I mean, we don't make food choices in a vacuum. I think in this country in particular, willpower tends to get highly overrated as a way to like fix these problems. Willpower and knowledge, if you just tell people what to do, that they'll be able to enact it, right? We make food choices in the context of what we call the food environment that we do, and that's a whole field of research looking at, you know, the choices that we make, are determined by, of course, our individual factors, our income, our personal preferences, our nutritional needs, but then outside of that, there's our social environment. So we tend to eat more like the people in our family, our colleagues and people around us. Broader than that, there's our physical environment. So even something like the presence or absence of a sidewalk could mean the difference between being able to safely walk to a grocery store versus not. Where things are placed on the shelves, and then of course policy, right? So we exist within these concentric circles of influences upon what we eat. So I would never say that we should put all the focuses on purely changing behavior. I think we need to make policy changes as well. And those changes don't have to be limited to, we tend to think of policy changes, oh, like who we elect at federal office, right? But it's also state, local policy and the policies of Sodexo, Aramark, whoever's a student here, we know like, where do we get food for, who determines what's sold in the cafeteria? You can talk to Rachel about that. She's not only written reports, but worked very closely to change what's available at Johns Hopkins cafeterias, right? So policy change is not just government policy, it's also the policy of the food procurement and institutions that I think along with stuff.
I would just add one thing too, from the like emergency food side of it, USDA, FEMA, they play a really big role in providing food in emergency situations. And so part of the work is also what types of foods are they providing? Is the food sustainable? Is it culturally appropriate? Is it just a box of emergency food, or is it more than that? And they're having to fund quite a bit of emergency foods with the increase we're seeing in disasters. And so how can you utilize and leverage that to support small farmers, to support foods that are kind of medically tailored? So how can you leverage that piece that they're already spending a lot of money on to kind of shift the food system in direction that it's going for?
And I'll just add a brief aside, if that's something you're passionate about, there's a lot of work at the multiple levels across the country, but currently right now at the federal level, pushing the Biden administration to do some administrative actions to standardize and implement more values-aligned food procurement practices across federal agencies. So shifting those billions of dollars of funds across all these different agencies to have more climate-friendly and other culturally appropriate foods values based, so labor standards. There's a whole gamut of values that they're looking at. But if you're interested in that, I'm happy to connect you with some of the people who are working on those campaigns.
Just an administrative note, we're out of time, but nobody is coming into this room. And so in a way now you're facing a choice between eating food or talking about food. If you want to keep talking about food, like you can keep the conversation going.
When we were talking about access to food and food choices, and then also discussing like policies, the thing that occurs to me is the independence from food systems, and I wonder how much that factors into any of this work. So I'm a forager, and I think people learning to eat what's growing everywhere that we are could make tremendous differences in like resilience and the health of people and environments. So I wonder what role that plays in any of this work.
I'll go ahead and start, but I think that's a great question and one that people are thinking a lot about in terms of urban agriculture or foraging, or what are the food sources within the communities of the jurisdiction where people are living. And there's a lot of different attributes that I didn't talk about what can make a food system more resilient. Things like redundancies within it, diversity across it. And there's a place for these types of foods that if a supply chain disruption occurs, what are the other sources of food within a community that are also there? What are the mutual aid networks that exist to kind of support people in getting food, that if there's one major transportation route that brings most of the food into a city and a flood occurs and the bridge is no longer available and trucks can't actually bring food into it, what are the sources of food within the community and how can those be bolstered and supported both in the disaster situation, but also when disasters aren't occurring because there's many other resiliency benefits of other types of kind of food production.
We did a study on Baltimore's urban foragers. That study was really near and dear to my heart. Did we interview for that one? Oh, we should have. Okay. Yeah, it was amazing. We wanted to investigate these very questions. Like, where are people foraging and what are they harvesting? And we were surprised, by volume, one of the top number one forage species in Baltimore by Baltimore foragers. Can you guess what it was? I wasn't expecting it. It was Mulberry was up there. Mulberry was in the top 5. Nice. Yeah. I think number 1 was stinging nettle.
Oh, good.
And I was like, oh my gosh, I mean, I've had these things whack me in the face. They really hurt. But I think they're actually very healthy. I think Rachel, you've cooked them before too. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. I think we're all for foraging. I think it is good to keep in mind too, just in terms of how easy it is to scale those up and the amount of time. And again, I'm not throwing shade on foraging. Absolutely love it. But just in terms of the amount of returns that one gets, if one's maybe not an expert in terms of how much is out there. A lot of people ask about hunting. Like hunting seems like a great sustainable alternative to the prevailing industrial model. And I say, you know what? I mean, it's free range in a sense. So I say, go for it, more power to you. But in terms of, I hate to use the phrase feeding the world because it gets overused, but it is good to keep in mind that in the United States alone, we slaughter 9 billion animals per year. Just to give it, like they outnumber us 7 to 1. Like we're outnumbered by chickens alone. There's 7 chickens for every human in the United States. Think of how many of those are in the room. So it's just good to keep in mind of like the sheer magnitude of production that's required to feed us, and how to what degree could hunting actually make a dent in that supply before we've wiped out all of this. Again, I'm not saying that those aren't good things, particularly from a resilience standpoint. But they also, I think, have to be considered in the context of the magnitude of the amount, the sheer mass of food that we eat. And then not even considering the fact that there's going to be more and more mouths.
Well, I was going to say one quick thing about, just in talking about the producers of food and the waste that they produce and how much money they make off of making this food that gets thrown away, and like how are we encouraging food producers to pay back what they're damaging in food waste, and how much they're adding to greenhouse gases in their food production. Because I think when you're talking about access, people don't have, they're not getting paid enough, they can't buy the food, but these people are still producing very expensive products that are also costing in other ways. I don't know, that was just thinking.
If I could chime in and say that it's a very complicated situation, because to be honest, a lot of the farmers in the United States are also experiencing food insecurity and not making enough money to live. So there's actually an analysis the USDA does of the food dollar and how much of the money that you spend on food goes to the farmer versus the other parts of the supply chain. And it's actually a very small portion, I think like less than 15%. It's those people, those groups in the middle. So the processors and the large aggregation companies that make a lot of that portion. So there are efforts to try to address consolidation and I'm thinking of another word right now, but consolidation in the food industry as a whole and addressing some of those issues. And then there's also the fact that there is work being done to address the food waste side of the equation in terms of trying to support farmers to help divert food that would otherwise go to waste by providing tax incentives for donating that food. There are ethical complications with that too, in the sense of you can't just rely on food that would be wasted to go to people who can't afford food. So there are challenges with this principles, and there are other efforts underway to try to make unsexy vegetables more sexy, and like different ways of trying to reduce our food waste. So it's one of those both and approaches that Brent was talking about. We have across the food system, we have a lot of different ways we have to address these issues.
You had mentioned the statistic, I think, in sub-Saharan Africa, that families wanted to have 4.1. That was you.
4.4.
4.4. Is that the families that want it or the women that
Women.
want it?
They ask
And-
women,
I'm sorry?
they ask women, if you ask men, you get even higher numbers. In
And
why?
so if they want that many, would contraception really help? Because they wouldn't want the contraception.
You're right, that's a big problem. Well, there's, I think 150 million to 200 million, depending on how you count it. It's called unmet need. Of women who say they want to space or limit their births and don't have access to contraception. Now, don't have access in quotes because it's not that it's a mile away or 5 miles away. Sometimes that's there also, but sometimes the husband wants more. They said if you ask the husband to get a condom or something. Anyway, so yes, it's difficult. One has to, the government of Bangladesh did an excellent job. I worked in Bangladesh for a while and they had campaign to lower the desired family size. They had big posters and one of them, they had a family with 4 or 5 kids and they didn't have shoes and they were in ragtags and that sort of thing. And next to it, a family with 2 children and they had school books and they had shoes and this thing. And the slogan was, "Total for a bar, cheap for a bar," which is small family, happy family. And it got caught on. The farmers knew they couldn't keep dividing their land with 8 children sort of thing. Also, so the messages have to be there to bring down the desired family size. Yes.
Interesting, thank you.
So I've heard that, I'm very interested in this notion of alternative proteins being positive as sustainable alternatives and trying to address this distinct protein transition between high income countries and low income countries. But I've also noticed that there's very limited research into the actions, environmental assessments and evaluations of the products, a lot of which are just marketed as being sustainable and should I can name 2 or 3 core brands which present themselves as being improvements in the protein side of offerings that we have. So what do you have to say maybe about the role of alternative proteins in kind of mitigating the problems discussed?
So we did do a paper on this. And it's complicated. So if you're comparing to beef, beef is on almost all environmental metrics, at least, generally has the highest environmental impact. So if you're comparing one of these alternative proteins to beef, it's going to look more sustainable. So when you start comparing to other animal products, that it gets trickier, and it depends on which products you're comparing. So plant-based proteins, for instance, so some of the meat substitutes that are currently on the market that are attempting to replicate the taste of meat, but made from plant proteins, so Beyond Burger, Impossible, but there are a lot of other varieties too. They tend to fall from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, kind of similar to poultry. So they're not going to radically change our future, but they are substantially better than beef. So it depends on if you're replacing chicken with these products, you're not going to necessarily have a major climate benefit. You might have other benefits from public health perspective, but there are also a lot of unknowns. We still don't know the public health impacts of eating super processed plant-based proteins for every meal of the day for your whole life. We do have very clear evidence of the health and environmental benefits of eating those plants directly. So eating pulses and beans and lentils as part of a whole diet, because many cultures around the world have always done that. So there's some very clear benefits there. The around cultivated meat, there are even more unknowns, but I would say it's kind of similar in that probably better than beef, but probably kind of similar to some of the other meats. But there's a lot more research that needs to be done, and it's not necessarily that we should avoid those options, but we should also be very careful in interpreting what the companies are sharing, because they usually try to present the best case comparison. So they'll compare the impact of cultivated meat compared to beef, and they're using the 100% renewable energy scenario once it's fully up to scale in 2030. And you're like, well, wait a second, that's not what we're looking at when we're talking about replacing chicken with cultivated chicken. So you just have to be really careful in seeing what statistics they're using and how they're presenting it.
Thank you.
And building on that point, there's a lot of nuance in terms of which greenhouse gases are being generated by the different production methods and how easy or difficult it is to mitigate those emissions. So cultivated or cellular or lab grown meat, whatever you want to call it, for example, most of the climate impact of that is from the energy that's used, I believe, to run the bioreactor. So it's a fairly energy intensive process. Whereas for beef, we're mainly looking at methane and nitrous oxide coming out of the burping and manure. So there are different sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And there are different strategies for them to go. So like Rachel said, if we were to shift to 100% renewable energy grid, we should be less concerned about the energy use that's going in to run the bioreactors. Whereas you can change the energy grid, that's not going to change the cowbirds. There are other things we can do for the cowbirds, and that's another conversation. Just to keep in mind, like different gases from different food have different mitigation strategies.
And there's one,
Like, one more little piece that on my mind, and I'll talk to you about it after the session, but there's the emergency piece, right? So like those models are certainly not meeting like the climate crisis emergencies that are also accelerating at the same time. Like they're not really the solution to those kinds of situations. Like they're fine for when things are really stable and everything is great, you know, like as a potential alternative, but they're not gonna be the solution to like feeding the world, you know, if you're dealing with things like an unstable energy grid and flooding and wildfires and your, you know, like, and basic issues around like, you know, what you're trying to get at. And I think some of this is just, it gets lost in the marketing propaganda. I mean, that's my area of infant feeding, like I'll ask you about that later.
Yeah.
If that's another piece of that, but marketing shapes like what you think might be solutions that may be like an option, but they're not gonna address like those larger issues around, you know, the inequities in the food system that we're dealing with.
in that, taking into account the time that we're at, I'll let one more question go, and then I want you all to be able to eat too.
There's a lot of interest in sort of providing regard as well for modern times, kind of climate gardens, personal household gardens where they're growing food with their pets. And there seems to be like a lot of energy and excitement around this. I want to see if you think that household gardens in the US actually play a role in sort of changing consumption habits and food system, or you think that maybe you sort of this is an exercise of individual there's still like people to food source again. And it's a simple component, but it's not really finished.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So we've done a lot of work. That's a great question. We've done a lot of work on urban agriculture in Baltimore City. Rachel and I have looked at, you know, what are people growing? How much are they growing? Where are they growing? How extensive is it to grow? There are a lot of questions. So I just want to briefly tie it back to the question about equity and safety. And whenever, I know you're not talking about cities necessarily, but at least in the context of cities, people always want to ask questions about, well, you know, to what degree might that soil potentially be contaminated with lead or arsenic or other heavy metals that we might find in a city with a history of industrial activity? And that can be an equity piece where you might have low-income households with potentially more exposure to hazards from demolished buildings, knock down building, all that lead goes up in the air and then deposits on the land near a growing site. So that would be, which is not to say that rural agriculture is somehow pristine and free from climate. But yeah, and I think I always think too about the scaling up question, like to what degree are households making it, and I think it's not an insignificant thing. The other piece too is I think we sometimes look to local food as a solution to climate change, because naturally we think about the combustion of fossil fuels to move food from point A to point B. Now there's been some varying estimates on how much food miles contribute to the greenhouse gas emissions from climate change. Earlier, there were estimates that would suggest that what we eat is far more important than how far it travels, because the production side is the largest share of greenhouse gas emissions, whereas the food transport side, again, different estimates have maybe put it a little higher than they used to, but it's not the dominant source of greenhouse gases in the food system. Which is not to say that we shouldn't grow household gardens, but I would also just caveat by saying eating locally wouldn't necessarily be the solution to climate change. On the other hand, I think you maybe did find some literature on like urban garden farms and gardens, community gardens participation increasing food and vegetable intake.
Yeah, there's, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it can provide a substantial amount of vegetables during the growing season for an individual household. So in some cases, a third to a half of their produce consumption during those growing months. So in terms of an economic boost for family incomes, it could, and increased consumption of fruits and vegetables and other healthy foods are all very important contribution factors. I think the other thing to keep in mind is it's very time and labor intensive to grow your own food. And a lot of families are struggling to find time to even cook their own food and prepare foods at home. And so recognizing that it is a certain privilege to be able to have the time to grow your food while balancing children and multiple jobs, and that we have to, I don't think it's that we should turn away home gardens, there are actually a lot of benefits too, in the sense of, I think the more that you've grown your own food, the more you can value what goes into producing food and probably waste it less. And respect the labor workers across the supply chain. Like there's so many other elements and benefits of growing your own food, but it might not necessarily be the solution to all the challenges in terms of access, equity, finances, and long-term sustainability.
What do you think about resiliency?
Well, I was thinking about it from a sustainability standpoint, that another part of my work is on implementation of sustainable healthy diets, particularly programs, local government programs in schools. And I think that last part of the question is really interesting, of what other things does it change? How does it impact behavior? How does it impact policy? What about a child that's exposed to it? And then what happens when they grow up, when they bring it home? And in my research, I haven't seen particularly good answers to those questions, more the behavioral side of it and the policy side of it, and what kind of influence and role it might play in that. From a resiliency point of view, I think it's similar to, like, it's generally seen as like backup resources, additional diversity of resources, diversity of food sources, but probably not the primary emergency food supply system that's going to be used in the case of disasters.
Thank you all.